Okay, everyone. So the first new grammar point that we're going to be discussing in Japanese 2050 is one that you may have heard about in passing before. And it's one that we're just going to kind of start to scratch the surface of here in Japanese 2050. So this is a concept called keigo. Keigo, which means like polite language. So of course we've been learning to speak politely so far when we use des and mas forms. But we also have some more forms in Japanese that are like even more polite and even higher level of politeness. So keigo has some different parts to it. The first part is teinego. And this is kind of the des and mas forms that we've been using up to this point. But it also has concepts like sonkeigo. Sonkeigo is honorific speech that we use for people of higher status than ourselves. It also has bikago, which are words that we use to kind of like make our speech sound a little bit nicer and more polite. So this is things like putting go before words, putting o before words, which we've seen a little bit. We've seen words like ocha and osake and okane, or putting words like titles like sama at the end. So this is something that we'll talk about today. And then we also have kenjogo, which is like modest and humble speech. This is something we'll talk about in chapter 20. So for today, we're going to mostly focus on the sonkeigo, the honorific forms, and the bikago, which we use to kind of make our speech a little bit more like pretty. でも、どうして? Why bother using keigo in the first place? Why do we make it so complicated? So keigo are words that we use to show respect for the listener or the people who are being referred to. So specifically, the sonkeigo that we are going to learn in this chapter, the honorific language, we use to talk about a person that we want to show social respect to. So it might be somebody in a higher social status, which would be like, for example, your boss, your teacher. It might be like an older person, or it might be a customer at your job. Or we also might use it with people that we just don't know very well. We don't use this honorific language when we're talking about ourselves or our family or about the group that we belong to. So this honorific language, we talk about a person we show respect to. So this is about their actions. And we are going to try and use this language to elevate that person relative to us. To kind of show that person that they have a higher status and raise them up. So, for example, like if I am Tanaka-san and I am talking about shacho, who has higher status than me, when I'm talking about the shacho's actions, I might say, instead of in a normal conversation, I would say, どこに行きましたか? 東京に行きました. But with keigo, I might change a little bit this どこ or 行きました. Or in a normal conversation, I might ask, 新幹線で行きましたか? But in keigo, I would phrase it a little bit differently. When do I use this? I can use this either when I'm talking about the person of higher status or when I'm talking to them. So I might say 社長は東京に行きました when I'm talking to somebody else. In this case, I might also change my way of speaking to show an honorific language. We also have the bikago, which these ones are just kind of different words that we use. So for example, instead of saying さん we might say 様. Instead of saying こっち, こちら. Instead of 人, 方. And instead of この人, こちら. Instead of 子供, お子さん. Instead of 奥さん, 奥様. Instead of 家, お宅. Instead of どう, いかが. Instead of 誰, どなた or どちら様. Instead of どこ, どちら. And instead of 何人, 何名様. So these are ones, and you'll find them kind of listed among the vocab of this chapter. These are ones where we just might pick a different word to be more respectful. So instead of talking about 社長の家, I might talk about 社長のお宅. For nouns and adjectives, we also sometimes make the nouns and adjectives more polite by adding on an o or go to them. So for example, I might say something like お水, お名前. We've heard お名前 before, right? Or お忙しい, お仕事, お上手, お好き, おタバコ, お元気. There are other nouns and adjectives that I might make more polite by putting like a go in front of them. So I say words like ご相談, ご病気, ご両親, ご兄弟, ご主人, ご親切. As for when I should use o and when I should use go, it can be a little tricky to tell. So a lot of the time the rule is that the O's go with like Japanese origin words and the go's go with like Chinese origin words. So the O's go with kunyomi and the go's go with onyomi. But that doesn't work every time. That doesn't apply to everything, unfortunately. So we kind of have to go with what we've heard before. The only real way is to kind of listen when people speak keigo and kind of practice with that. So this is something that you will get more and more used to the more Japanese that you speak. The main thing that we are going to focus on today, though, is the son keigo. So son keigo, we have, when we have verbs, some of the verbs are going to have completely new vocabulary. So instead of using the word taberu, we'll use a completely different word. We have some other words, though, that are changed by like a set pattern. And we can, all of these verbs, they work like any other verb, which means that we can conjugate them into any way that we want in order to fit the sentence, in order to fit the context. We can also change the ending. So we could have like an honorific verb with a short form ending, depending on the situation. So these work like any other verb. We just have some special verbs and some that have like a set pattern that we have to change them to. So let's start with the words that have some special verbs. Our first one is いらっしゃる. So one of the things that is a little bit tricky about some of our keigo verbs is some of them have kind of changed to the way that they're pronounced over time. So the mas form is a little special. So we have いらっしゃる, but the mas form is going to be いらっしゃいます. Maybe you have heard this sound, いらっしゃいます before. That's right, we have いらっしゃいませ when you go into a store, right? So いらっしゃる, いらっしゃいます. And this is a word that will replace いる, 行く, and 来る. So instead of saying 先生がいます, I can say 先生がいらっしゃいます. Instead of saying 先生が学校に行きます, I can say 学校にいらっしゃいます. Instead of 図書館に来ます, I can say 図書館にいらっしゃいます. And I can tell which one of these, いる, 行く, or 来る, I'm using based on the context. So, いらっしゃる, いらっしゃいます. The next one is なさる and なさいます. なさる and なさいます goes in the place of する. Next is ご覧になる and ご覧になります. ご覧になる replaces 見る. Next is おっしゃる おっしゃいます. おっしゃる replaces you. So once again, おっしゃる is one of the ones that's a little bit weird in mas form, so be careful. おっしゃる、おっしゃいます. Next up, 召し上がる、召し上がります. 召し上がります will replace both 飲む and 食べる. We can tell the difference based on the context. Be careful, some people have a little bit of difficulty pronouncing this word. It's 召し and then 上がります. 上がります. Next is くださる and くださいます. This is another word that might sound kind of familiar to you, right? We have ください. So ください comes from this くださいます. It's a replacement for くれる. And お休みになる、お休みになります. お休みになる is a replacement for 寝る. So let's review together. You can take a minute if you need to. What are the special honorific words that we would use to replace each of these verbs? How would we put them into long form? Take a minute, you can pause the video if you need to, and then we'll check together. Okay, are we ready to check? So, 行く, 来る, いる. The honorific, the short form is いらっしゃる. する is なさる. 見る ご覧になる. 言う おっしゃる. 食べる and 飲む are 召し上がる. くれる くださる. 寝る お休みになる. Now, how would I change these ones to long form? So, いらっしゃる, it's a little bit special. It will change to いらっしゃいます. なさる to なさいます. ご覧になる to ご覧になります. おっしゃる to おっしゃいます. 召し上がる to 召し上がります. くださる to くださいます. And お休みになる to お休みになります. So in other words, most of them are regular must form, but いらっしゃる, なさる, おっしゃる, くださる. Instead of putting a D, we put an E. So just be a little careful of those. So that's all the ones that have a special kind of verb with them. But of course, there's tons of other verbs, right? So when we want to take any other verb and make it honorific, we're going to make, well, I kind of nickname it the honorific sandwich. So we have two parts that we're going to add, one on either side. And then in the middle, we put the verb stem. So remind me, what is the stem form of the verb? The stem form of the verb is whatever we want to put before mas, right? So instead of saying 帰る, we have 帰り. So 帰る, 帰り, and then we want to put our two pieces of bread on either side. Our o at the beginning and ni naru at the end. So 帰る o 帰りになる o 帰りになる Don't forget the o and don't forget the ni naru. We have to have both to make it make sense. How about yomu? So the verb stem is yomi, right? So we're going to put our two sides to it. O yomi ni naru. O yomi ni naru. So o plus the verb stem plus ni naru. And this applies to any verb that wasn't in the set that we talked about before. Any verb that doesn't have a special word for it. So when we're in a situation where we have to use 尊敬語を使わなければならない situation, then first we have to think, is there a special 尊敬語 word that goes with it? If yes, then we use the special 尊敬語 word. If no, then we're going to use this o verb stem ni narimasu pattern. The only thing to keep in mind is that when we have two verbs involved, like one of our combo verbs, we don't want to change both of them to an honorific. That's like a little bit too extreme. So like if we have nonde imasu, that's made up of like nomu, nonde, and imasu. So we don't want to say meshiagatte irashaimasu and change both of them. That's too much. So instead we're just going to pick one to change. So we might say meshiagatte imasu. Or if we have yonde imasu, we don't want to say oyomi ni natte irashaimasu. That's too much. So instead we're just going to pick one. Yonde irashaimasu. So just keep in mind that we don't put two together in honorific language. We're just going to pick one verb. Okay, so that is the basics of how to use 尊敬語 honorific language in your speech. See if you can use the information to answer some of the following questions.